The moderator for this session is Anant Nath, who is the editor of the Caravan magazine, as well as the General Secretary of the Editors Guild of India. He started the magazine in 2010 as India's first magazine dedicated to narrative journalism. I would now request Anant to take over the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa, and everyone for joining us today. On behalf of Editors Guild, I thank everyone. And I'd also welcome the panelists for this session, Mr. Ninan and Paranjoy. We're just waiting for Paranjoy to join in. Good afternoon, Mr. Ninan. If you could unmute yourself, Mr. Ninan, I think we are. All right, so we are waiting for Paranjoy to join, but
you hear me now?
Yes. Okay. Yeah. We'll just take a second before Paranjoy joins. But to lay the context of the session, so we started the first session, dedicated to reporting on politics, and of course, it laid the overall, background and foundation of what we're discussing here. That the political establishment, especially in the last few years, has sort of set the norm on how independent journalism is being viewed. And we've seen, the government of the day employ a mix of tools at their disposal to control how media is reporting on them. And we've discussed, and the panelists discussed various ways, starting from control of access, physical access to government institutions, to working with journalists who are so-called more pliant, not giving information, not giving interviews, not holding press conferences, PMO not holding press conferences, and just curtailing and shutting down the access of establishment government to journalists and media organizations. And beyond that, of course, there have been various other tools, from putting out legislations which will control the way journalism is published on digital platforms, and then, of course, which will have a cascading effect on print, television, and every other format. Instituting cases using government agencies on journalistic organizations which are seen as anti-establishment, the threat of government advertising, and also advertising from corporates which are close to the government, and various other ways of even going after independent journalists, trolling them, labeling them as anti-national, and so on and so forth. And from there, we move to sports journalism, which for those of you who were part of who witnessed the last session would probably empathize that while political journalism, of course, occupies a larger share of airwaves when we talk about the deteriorating landscape for media rights and media freedom, we must also recognize that maybe fields like sports, including business, maybe films, the topics that we're covering through the day, are even more difficult, because the sense at one end is that politicians and political leaders are more attuned to be accountable. They are more attuned to be asked questions. This is what they do. Whereas establishments which are far more tightly controlled, like sports, and we heard that how sports in the country today is also controlled by businesses. It's at the end of the day controlled by a very few and very select cohort of business establishments who do not want any kind of negative coverage in media, and they employ the same tool that political establishment employs: access, business, advertising. The way media establishments have been sort of roped in to be partners in their publicity and promotion, and also going after independent journalists or any kind of organization with threats of lawsuits and so on and so forth. So the environment seems to be far more stifling, far more difficult for any kind of independent journalist, just because the source of access, the establishments controlling, are far fewer. And what the session today sort of, in a way, builds further, because sports itself is business, as every panelist spoke in the previous session. From there, if you take the larger question of what is the space for business journalism? Is there space for independent objective reporting on businesses in the country? Is the dependency on businesses far more than we sometimes talk about openly? and the way big corporates control, both the landscape of media, as well as the way they control the PR machinery and the way they go after independent journalists, is something that we often don't talk about openly, because our emphasis is always on politics. But maybe here is where the larger problem lies, because media is now the model of media, the way it operates, and their dependency on big businesses is so much more in an advertising-driven model that it really curtails the media's ability to, in fact, do even independent political journalism. So, Mr. Ninan, if we could start with you, Paranjoy is still joining. If you could sort of lay the landscape of the environment in which business journalists and business media operates, and the kind of controls they are subjected to from corporates.
Thank you, Anant. You know that I am really out of active journalism. So some of what I say, I'm not in the front line. I have some idea of what is going on, but I want to take a slightly different tack from what I heard being said on the last two sessions. And I want to begin by saying that we as journalists in India have a massive advantage over journalists in many other countries, in that the trust factor given to the media in India is of an order of magnitude higher than it is in most Western democracies, where faith in journalists and the media has really plummeted. And that is not the case over here. The Pew Research about 6 years ago, I think, or 5 years ago, subsequent work by the Reuters Institute, again using Ipsos to do market surveys, have shown that traditional media itself has very much higher credibility. So that's an asset that we have. The second point that came through, certainly in the Reuters Institute work, was that readers differentiate between mainstream traditional media, which often gets a bad name, and the platform media, Twitter, Facebook, WhatsApp, Google, TikTok, the whole bunch. And there is very much less credibility to the news that they access on these platform media, sometimes as low as 1/3 of what traditional media credibility levels are. Google is slightly different. It scores the best among the platform media, but even that is much lower than traditional media. So we must function with the awareness that we have a public that believes in us and what we do far more than in most other countries, almost without exception. So I just want to put that on the table as an issue that we should not forget. The second point I want to make is that while business journalism is a part of general journalism and therefore faces all the constraints that you have mentioned and all the constraints that panelists in the previous two sessions have mentioned, it is also a specific subset with its own specific environment. And I want to break this up into three further subsets: reporting on the economy, reporting on business, and reporting on markets. And these three are very different entities. The easiest is reporting on markets and market-related information, because you have a functioning stock market, you have a functioning debt market. Markets can only function if there's reliable information. So you have the whole paraphernalia of regulators and auditors and rating agencies, all of which are trying to get at the truth, and independent directors on boards. So there is a functioning ecosystem that has a vested interest in putting out reliable information. And you have a whole paraphernalia of broking houses with their own independent researchers and analysts also putting out information. So reporting on markets and to some extent even business is now vastly easier and in fact qualitatively better than it was, let's say, 2 or 3 decades back. So we must be conscious of the fact that the environment has got better for this kind of reporting. The second point I want to make about business is that is less good news, because businesses have learned how to operate from behind PR screens and they used to be, certainly in the days when I was an active reporter, they used to be easily accessible. The country's top businessmen would take your phone calls, they would meet you. And that by and large is no longer the case. Everything functions from behind a PR wall. So it's got worse in that sense. And then you have the whole, phenomenon of excessive litigation in an environment where we know that crony capitalism operates, where the links between business and politics, a lot of it beyond the pale of legitimate or legal activity. And so reporting on that is particularly hazardous. But I believe that it is still possible to do the reporting. And it is a test for us as journalists to be able to find a way to do that reporting. And it is interesting to me that very often the breakthroughs are done by independent journalists with limited resources, functioning on their own, who break the stories. I mean, Paranjoy is actually a good example, which the mainstream media does not do, which the mainline publications or TV channels do not do. So this is really a test for us to function in a more difficult environment and show what we're capable of. Political journalism is different in the sense that even sports journalism increasingly, as we heard, in that access is critical to what you're able to do. But the point about business journalism is that there is data. So it does not have to be access related. There's information out there if you go and look for it properly. And there are ways of looking for information. So we're not constrained by denial of access. You can still get at the truth in a variety of ways. So to my mind, reporting on business, while more challenging than in the past, is a challenge that journalists have to rise to. That's my point. And finally, on macroeconomic reporting, the government tries to suppress information. There was a consumer survey, consumption survey, which they suppressed. There's an employment survey, which they suppressed. But frankly, the truth is that both the survey data came out. They got leaked, which again underlines my point that we have to learn to function. We know that the situation has got more difficult. We know that the government is hostile to media. We know that access for journalists has become much more difficult. But I also know that beat reporters do manage to get access because at the end of the day, there are people who are willing to answer your questions. So to my mind, while I acknowledge that the whole environment is more difficult and indeed more hostile than it used to be, we have examples to show that the real test is for us to measure up to this challenge. And it is a signal point that very often independent journalists with limited information, with limited resources, websites with far more limited resources, independent websites with far more limited resources than mainline publications are able to do the investigation and achieve the breakthroughs that are otherwise not being done. So my focus would be on saying we need to do our jobs better because we have a market out there that believes in what we do. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ninan. Paranjoy, glad to see you finally logged in.
I hope you're able to hear me.
Yes, very well so.
Okay, thank you.
Paranjoy, yes.
I'm sorry, Ninan, I couldn't hear much of what you said. I was having some connectivity issues, which I can't figure out why it happened. So maybe, Anant, you can briefly summarize some of the points that Mr. Ninan made.
I'll maybe lay the context of the point that Mr. Ninan made. And the large question was that we've heard panelists on talk about political journalism and the constraints and the controls that establishments put on journalism, which we're all aware of. Often, the discussion is on how political establishment is becoming very intrusive or very myopic. But the question is, what is the status of business journalism? Is there independent business journalism in the country, or is there a conducive environment for independent reportage on how businesses are operating, especially the big businesses, which are far more accountable to their stakeholders, the ones which are listed, which are public money, and even the listed companies which anyway control important stakes in the way the economy is shaping up. Given the environment where media is so largely dependent on advertising, the threats of lawsuits, slap lawsuits, you've been at the receiving end of many such lawsuits, the way big businesses go after independent journalists, and of course then the media organizations that employ journalists who would want to do some kind of critical reporting. So what kind of an environment landscape we work in? It seems that some of these sectors can be far more difficult to report on just because the establishments that control a certain sector, we heard about sports, are far more edgy, far more sort of sensitive, and their locus of control is far stronger than maybe in the political landscape where there's one central government and many state governments, and there could be multiple ways to sort of balance out what you're trying to do. So yeah, that's, if you could sort of start with your thoughts.
Okay. Thank you, Anand. Thank you for inviting me to this program. Indeed, what you're saying is absolutely correct. Independent reporting on business houses, large corporate entities, corporate conglomerates has never been easy. Why? Simply, as you rightly pointed out, the big bucks that are involved, armies of public relations officers, and it's quite easy for them to get journalists, many of whom are not always that well paid, invite them to fancy hotels and fancy restaurants and give them all the food that they can eat and all the booze that they can drink. And, that's a good way of not ensuring that, uncomfortable truths are often not brought out in the public domain. That's one part of the story. The second part of the story is that the advertiser, if these same corporate conglomerates, if these same big business entities are also major advertisers, and if the concerned publication or the website or the media organization depends on these larger advertisers, then journalists are often told, don't report this. Where's your next month's salary going to come from? I'm putting it somewhat crudely, but that's often, so there's a pressure of the big business group as an advertiser. And now what we are seeing is that when business groups are particularly close to politicians in power, be they in Delhi or be they elsewhere, then the pressure can also come from political sources or political parties. You don't dig too deep, don't rake up too much muck on A or B or C. So yeah, that would be a kind of a summary. I would say it's always been challenging and things have become worse. Things haven't really improved. And my own experience shows that, I've been a journalist for now over 45 years. Much of that time has been spent on reporting on business organizations, on trying to examine the nexus between business and politics. And certainly if you're an independent journalist like I am, and I don't have the support of a major organization, then life gets a little more difficult, irrespective of whether you are accredited with the government of India, the Press Information Bureau, as I am, or with state governments. The last point that I want to make in this context is that then come the extra legal ways. Simply put, you're intimidated. There are enough goons who tell you, don't mess around too much. And especially if you're not in a major city, if you're not an English-speaking journalist, if you are belonging to a relatively remote or a small town, these pressures can be very, very significant. And of course, then comes the suits, the frivolous lawsuits, the what we often call SLAPP, strategic litigation against public participation. I myself had the honor and the privilege of receiving these love letters from lawyers representing both the Ambanis, the older brother and the younger brother, Subrata Roy Sahara, the family that runs the Times of India group, among others. And most recently, I'm the only citizen of India against whom Mr. Gautam Adani's lawyers have instituted 6 cases of defamation that are currently pending in different courts of law, 5 in Gujarat and 1 in Rajasthan. And 2 of them involve a gag order. But I've decided to speak out, provide facts in the public domain. I was absolutely silent. I would say I was also intimidated for about 2.5 years because the gag orders came in September 2020. And then I sort of looked through everything. He said, I'm going to present facts. You are welcome to arrive at your opinion. If somebody makes an allegation against Mr. A or B or C, you verify its authenticity or credibility. And my life has become a little more hectic after I realized that I was the only journalist who had been named in the report of the Hindenburg Research short-selling firm in the US, which was published on the 24th of January. I stop here for the time being.
Thanks, Paranjoy. So I'll maybe pick up from the point that you made last, the threat of lawsuits. We've all, in our own line of work, have had lawsuits from corporates. They filed suits against us. The question, Mr. Ninan, we talk about this threat of lawsuits, these litigations being filed against journalists and media organizations. Now, of course, there is the process as the punishment being as the biggest deterrent. But let's say for a moment, one goes past the process as a punishment. What really is the final outcome in most of these cases? Because you would have seen the landscape of the last 40 years of journalism, maybe even more. Do these suits actually end up being deterrent in the sense that they impose heavy penalty on media organizations and journalists, or they are simply an intimidatory tactic?
Anant, to the best of my knowledge, there is as yet no, there may be one possibly, but there is no defamation suit with large penalties being imposed, which has actually come to a successful conclusion. So this is really more a threat and an intimidatory tactic than anything else. And once they feel that you've been sufficiently intimidated, they themselves lose interest in the case. They're not particularly actively pursuing the matter. I had experience of this in Business Standard in the mid-90s when we were sued for, I think at that time, 2,000 crores for something that turned out to be completely true because other facts came out and then the case became a non sequitur because the facts were clearly established. What we had argued was that Reliance was switching shares, and eventually UTI found that the shares had been switched and came out of that disclosure. So the case just died. But they did sue us, and we were a small newspaper at that time for a couple of thousand crores. So, but we didn't do anything. We just said we'll face it in court. But most cases don't. It's difficult for an individual person like Paranjoy to stand up to that kind of a threat. Easier for an organization who can pay the lawyers' fees. But I've always felt that organizations like the Editors Guild should actually be trying to get together either panels of lawyers who are willing to do pro bono work to defend what journalists do, or set up a legal aid fund of some sort to help individual journalists. So that's action that needs to be taken. But most such cases actually don't end up with any conclusion. To answer your question.
Paranjoy, yeah, you're at yeah.
To add to what TN Ninan said, the process is indeed the punishment. You know, sending replies, the time it takes, the energy it takes, and very often, you know, because India is among the few, I mean, it's possibly the only large democracy on the planet, you know, out of the 200 countries. Every country calls itself a democracy, that's a separate matter. But among the large countries where defamation is a criminal offense. There were several attempts made to decriminalize defamation, but that has not succeeded. A bench of the Supreme Court of India under the former, he was then not the Chief Justice, but Justice Deepak Mishra, had kind of argued that the right to a person's reputation and the right to free speech, you know, these two rights had to be balanced. A view that I personally disagree with. But the point is, what we are seeing is the chilling effect. How does it manifest itself? As Mr. Ninan rightly pointed out, these don't go anywhere. They just make life miserable for you. I'll give you one example. Mr. Adani's lawyers ensured that 4 of us, the editorial head of Newsclick, Prabir Purokasta, who's 75, a small shareholder, Raghunandan, who's 73, yours truly 67, and a young journalist, we had to travel all the way from Delhi to a village, a Gramin Nyayalaya, a small village court, where there was a case of defamation. We had to serve a bail bond. We had to find a person who would stand for surety. Now, Kota, this place is in a district called Baran in Rajasthan. It's kind of halfway between Delhi and Mumbai. So you have to travel 700 kilometers to Kota and then take a vehicle to travel another 100 plus kilometers. So all of these is not just money, it's time, it's different, it's a form of harassment. As he pointed out, the Anil Dhirubhai Ambani group, for media reports on the Rafale deal, had sued dozens of media organizations, mainly in Ahmedabad, dozens and dozens of them, and then withdrew everything. I mean, in between, the people concerned were harassed. So until defamation is decriminalized, we're going to see this problem. Last point, look at what's been happening in the recent past. The income tax, quote unquote, surveys on the BBC offices, British Broadcasting Corporation, now they've been served notices by the Enforcement Directorate. Look at what's happened not just to Newsclick, with which I've been associated as a consultant. Look what's happened to your organization, Caravan, Anand. Look what's happened to News Laundry, Dainik Bhaskar. You know, I could go on and on. And most importantly, and this Mr. Ninan knows because he's headed that organization, the tax people have gone to the offices and spent quite a bit of time at the offices of the IPSMF, the Independent and Public Spirited Media Foundation. That has been supporting a lot of several media organizations. And so the point is that, yes, the law is above nobody. None of us, you, me, everybody. The right to free expression, Article 19(1)(a) of the Constitution of India applies to every citizen, including journalists. Yes, I accept all that. But I also see a certain pattern in the manner in which journalists have been targeted in recent times.
Right. So changing the tack a bit here, we spoke about how PR, big businesses invest a lot in PR and how. Sorry, sir. Yes.
Anant, may I just come in with a brief comment?
Yes, please.
Before you switch subjects. I completely agree with what Paranjoy said about defamation being criminal in India, which is not the case in most other democracies. And in fact, the Editors Guild pleaded itself in the case on this in the Supreme Court some 10 years ago when I happened to be heading the guild, but it got nowhere. So the issue of being sued for excessive sums as damages, that problem does not get solved, even if there's no criminal defamation, because that is civil action. When you sue for damages, that is civil action. So slap as a problem does not go away, even if you remove criminality in defamation. That problem remains. So I just want to mention that.
Yeah. No, actually, that's an important point, Mr. Ninan, because we have seen the example, which is much talked about in England, where libel laws have been fairly adversely used against media. In fact, there have been instances where publications have been sued for heavy damages. And in fact, even though defamation is decriminalized there, the threat of lawsuits and the consequent penalty is a far bigger deterrent there. And even though we all agree that there is perhaps not been big precedents of any media houses being subjected to such heavy penalties in India so far, but the fact remains that the threat is there for sure, and therein the process itself also could be cumbersome. For independent journalists, for sure, it can be expensive. But actually, then I have an additional question, that for media houses who can afford this, and there is an argument to be made that every time a defamation suit is filed, and this is, I'm speaking from Caravan's example, whenever we have had a defamation suit filed against us by a business house, it was IIPM once, it was SR once, there was some threats by one of the Ambani groups. In a way, it was
an article which I wrote for the Caravan too.
And then there's an article that Paranjoy wrote for us. It is sort of a validation of the work. That is also seen as a validation of work we are doing, because we are seen as doing something which has touched a raw nerve and which has sort of ruffled some feathers. And in the cause of, independent journalism. So the question is that media houses which could actually, draw some shine out of such cases being filed against them, which may not result in the huge penalty that the case is all about, but maybe the procedural cost, which can be expensive for independent journalists, but maybe not so much for an established media house. Why still is the environment so, you could say, stifling or so scared of walking down that path of, taking on the onus of these challenges?
Okay, let me say that the law actually does give journalists some protection, because defamation works only if you can prove malice. There has to be mens rea. It is not proved just because you went wrong or made a mistake. It's important, of course, that you go through, that your reporter or whoever did the report went through due process, asked for the other side for its comment and what it had to say, and so on and so forth. But you have to show malice, and that's not easy. So there is, that is one reason why I think these intimidatory tactics don't go beyond a point, because how do you establish malice? So there is protection under the law, and the truth itself is a defense, of course. But I therefore agree that this is pure intimidation, it's process as punishment and all the rest of it.
Right. No, actually my question was that, yeah.
Let me just add something to what Mr. Ninan said. The state of the judiciary being what it is, these cases can go on for years and years. That's one part of the story. And this is something that you also know in the case of Caravan, the famous case involving Mr. Arindam Chaudhary. You can be dragged to some part of the country. In the case of Caravan, you were asked to appear, if I'm not mistaken, in Kachar in Silchar. In my case, we had to go to Baran in Rajasthan. So that is another aspect that, since you're a media organization, your publication is read here and there and everywhere across India and the world, you can literally be asked to appear any part of the country, because some reader or viewer has allegedly been hurt or felt that you have defamed somebody or the other. That's another problem I see.
There's another legal issue about the US law in defamation cases treats public citizens differently from private citizens. And so the standards for deciding on defamation for a public citizen, you're in politics. People will say all manner of things about you. So you have to take the rough with the smooth. And it's different from a private citizen. You suddenly start saying something about a guy who's living a private life. So then the risks are much greater. So we don't have this distinction in our law, but I think it is required. Some of the political speeches that are now being hauled up in courts and judgments being handed out, if they're involving public citizens, frankly, there should be a much stricter norm for deciding on defamation.
Hey, in the session on sports journalism, the panelists spoke about how establishment, BCCI in this case, or federations in whichever sport, it's about, they curtail access to journalists who are seen to be independent, and they, of course, limit it to journalists who are seen to be far more friendly. Now, in business journalism, I would presume, again, reporters are assigned to beats. So a real estate journalist is assigned to, is dependent on the real estate sector. Aviation journalist is dependent on its sector. And there's one journalist, presumably in a large newspaper, covering that entire beat. Given that how important that access might be, both for professional reasons and also personal reasons, because it could be an important thing for a journalist to be seen in company, or to be seen close to the corridors of power, close to the big aviation giant, or close to the big real estate giant, be seen close to that. Do you see, is that inherent deterrent in reporting sort of flowing into the pages of newspaper or whichever media organization it may be?
Well, as I said in my opening comments, Anant, and I don't know if Paranjoy was able to hear that, business journalism is less dependent on access than political journalism, or for that matter, it seems sports journalism. There is data. There are analysts. There are different ways of accessing data. Much of the data is public. There are other ways of accessing even non-public data. So you don't have to do only access journalism where you are able to meet the top guy and that access gives you information and stories. You can do non-access journalism and can do it very well. The breakthroughs that, what access did Hindenburg have? No access.
I can add to that. I can add to what Mr. Ninan said. If you look at the Hindenburg report, it's 32,000 words. And more than half of that information is already in the public domain for several years. They cited it. I know I've been writing several articles over the last 7 years that have been cited. There have been references to documents like show cause notices, which are in the public domain. I myself put up some of this. So I go along entirely with what Mr. Ninan is saying, that much of business journalism is like accessing data, connecting the dots, demystifying the facts, telling the story in a way the ordinary reader can understand. But access is not completely unimportant. Perhaps it's not as important for people reporting on politics or sports, but precisely say real estate, aviation. At least once upon a time, there used to be a lot of junkets provided to journalists. Somebody starting something new, or there's a new aircraft being purchased or whatever. You would see that you pick and choose people who you believe will reproduce your handout diligently and will not ask you questions, will not ask you difficult questions. So again, one of the ways you prevent that is to curtail access. The other thing is, when a journalist does due diligence and you send, say, a questionnaire to a particular corporate entity or a PR firm or the head of that particular company or group's corporate communications person, they don't respond. After the story is published, then they say, no, this story is not accurate, wrong, whatever. So what does a journalist do? You sought to get the other side of the story, but then you don't, that's another kind of access issues. So even when you try and do your due diligence, sometimes you're not successful.
Everything that Paranjoy has said is correct. But I know of a journalist who covers precisely the field that Paranjoy mentioned, which is civil aviation. And she has access to pilots, to People who used to be in a particular airline company have switched, gone to some other airline. She has access to mid-level management, top-level management. The way you do 360-degree knowledge of what is going on in the industry, at the end of the day, the owners or the top management have no choice other than to talk to you, because the report is going to be done anyway. So it is in their interest to talk. And if you're well informed, they can't bullshit you. So,
and Ninan, I presume you're referring to Anjali Bhargav.
I don't want to mention names, but
she's done excellent reporting. Excellent.
I keep coming back to my point that the challenge is for us journalists to function in a more difficult environment. The environment is beyond our control. It has to be taken as a given. But can you do your job in this environment? My answer is yes.
Sir, we spoke about this the other day. Advertising has, of course, been often blamed as a culprit because the business model is so dependent on advertising, and therefore the risks of doing a critical business story could be jeopardizing business. But besides advertising, this culture of awards and events that most media houses have sort of taken on over the last 15, 20 years. These are awards which are done for business reasons, but they're also done for branding reasons. And we spoke about this the other day as well, that if you're calling those business leaders who you ought to be reporting on to be speakers at the awards, to be attendees at the awards, and it's important for those business leaders to be at the panel. And often the reporter who's covering that beat is also asked to invite that business leader. Where does the whole, doesn't it sort of send the entire conflict of interest for a toss and put restrictions?
Anant, may I respond to what you said?
Yes, please go ahead.
I don't think it's confined to business journalism or economic journalism. It's true. It's equally relevant for those reporting on politics, those writing about politics or sports or several other things. Now, we all know that these big events are held, and they're held in fancy hotels, and they're you call everybody who matters, and people who want to be sitting on the front row. I presume they pay something to get there, and sometimes extra sort of allurements are put out that so-and-so is coming, this minister, this big gun, that big gun. So that's part of what has become today an important means for major media organizations to raise revenue. Fact. I'm not passing any comment about that. But what happens is precisely the point that you mentioned, Anant. The journalist who is there and is asked to report, what if he has a critical story about that particular person who has been called and who's an important speaker? So that sometimes results in a kind of self-censorship that's not always desirable. But it could also be, a different kind of a pressure that, look, Mr. X is close to my proprietor, my editor, and therefore I become a little wary if I have something to report which is not complementary to the concerned person. But once again, these are hurdles that can be overcome. And in that respect, I go along with what Mr. Ninan said. If you have something, if you have a good story and you have the facts to back it, and for whatever reason you can't publish it or you can't bring it out in the public domain, somebody else will. And very often, journalists often act as one another's sources, saying, hello, I've got something about A, B, or C, but I can't publish it because I lose my job, and I have to pay my daughter's school education, and my home fires may stop burning. So yeah, but these are the facts. You can do it. So that kind of trading of information also happens. But this is again, maybe such examples are not very, they're perhaps few and far between, but they exist.
Okay, Anant, my response to your question is a short one. Yes, there is a conflict of interest. The conflict is obvious. But I don't think, my understanding of it at least, is that the issue really isn't revenue. In the context of the total revenue that a media house would be earning in a year, what it gains from one or two or maybe more events, net of all the costs involved, is, I think, relatively small. So it's more a question of, I think it is more a question of image building, networking, getting advertisers in, getting ad agencies involved. So it's more that kind of exercise. That's my understanding. I know that Business Standard does its annual awards, and it's something I've always had, dual feelings about. But I know that there is a conflict of interest, and you try and manage it as best you can.
One small point, Anand, that I wanted to add is this is particularly true, I think, for all categories of journalists. They know that a particular journalist is actively covering party A or B or C. They know that a particular journalist is covering, corporate group X or Y or Z, or a particular sports journalist is close to a particular well-known sportsperson. So the management does indeed use use this fact to try and get them to convince these individuals to come to these events. So you're right, it keeps happening. Now, sometimes you can say, look, I can't do this. I can't convince A or B or C to come at your sponsorship, but I can tell you, you contact Mr. X or Ms. Y. Sometimes it works that way. Sometimes it doesn't. But yeah, there are conflicts of interest. Of course, there are conflicts of interest.
Right. I'm going to dial back to something that I think both of you touched upon in the opening remarks. Mr. Ninan, you felt that the landscape for objective journalism has actually improved over the years because markets respond to markets respond to data in its own way, and if the journalism doesn't match up to what the reality is, there will be a sort of inherent inbuilt check in terms of how the journalist's work is seen. And then, of course, the amount of data per se, maybe if we disregard the last few years, the way government has been sort of controlling it, but over the course of, let's say, 30 or 40 years, the amount of data out there is far more. So your argument that if somebody has to do journalism, there is enough and more available, and therefore the situation is improved. But Paranjoy, you were slightly more bleak about it. You felt that the space has actually become sort of curtailed. So I was wondering if there's a way to sort of reconcile these two views or contextualize these two views again for the larger interest.
Since I made that comment for Paranjoy, in case he didn't catch it, Anant, I want to repeat what I said at the outset, that I broke it up into different categories. So reporting on markets and companies is one set. Reporting on businesses and the whole corporate cronyism is second set of issues, and macroeconomic reporting the third set of issues. So it is in the specific context of reporting on companies and markets, where for markets to function, they can only function efficiently if they have good information. And that information comes through a whole paraphernalia which has now been created of auditors and independent directors and credit rating agencies and stock market regulators and the monetary authority. So there is a whole paraphernalia supporting a market-oriented economy. And since our markets have become more important than they used to be in the past, this whole change is a driver of change towards creating more information flows, more accurate information flows, more analysts playing the game, which therefore helps business journalists, and business journalism improves. That is my point. And it's within that specific context of markets, not in the context of the crony capitalism, business, politics nexus, or macroeconomic stuff.
Okay, to add to what Mr. Ninan says, I don't disagree with him at all. It's one thing to report on markets. It's another thing to report on the economy, the macroeconomics. You have data, you have sources, and then you can report on it, you can analyze, you can come to a conclusion whether unemployment in India is at its highest in 45 years or not. I mean, so those are, a combination of obtaining facts through verifiable sources, and then, reporting and analyzing those facts. I think the challenges that have come up in recent times also stems from the revenue model. I mean, as long as a media organization is heavily dependent on advertisers and corporate advertisers, and as we are seeing, dependence on grants, on philanthropies, on donations, on crowdfunding, we're seeing all that happen. But the revenue model still can be a constraint. And I'll give an example of the Hindenburg report. If somebody says, okay, told me, I'm going to give you X amount of money, send your person to Mauritius, send him or her to British Virgin Islands, the tax havens, says send them all over the world and dig up all that you can. Spend all those lakhs and lakhs of rupees to dig up all that. For that, you need resources. You need a certain commitment to getting at the truth without fear, without favor. And since we have discussed the Hindenburg report, the Hindenburg research report, this was one of those aspects. So having obtained much of that information, which is already scattered all over the public domain in India, you are not just connecting the dots, you're adding to it by sending your persons to different parts of the world. I mean, we know how tax havens try and conceal information, the way in which, for instance, information is not disclosed. But there are things are also changing, you see. For instance, if you go to a particular tax haven, they may not allow you to access records. They may not allow you to take photographs of the balance sheet, but they'll say, okay, you can sit here, you can take notes, keep your phone out, etc. So there are all kinds of things, because across the world, there's also been a certain amount of pressure, including what the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development has put out. It's called BEPS, base erosion and profit shifting. There's a certain concern across the world. But when you have to say report on tax havens, I know because I worked on a book on Mauritius. It costs money. And small media organizations usually can't afford to spend that kind of money for reportage.
Okay, I think we will. Sorry, sir. Are you?
No.
Something?
This is an ironic fact that the media companies that do have the resources will not spend it on this kind of work. And it is, and I said this at the beginning in my opening comments, that it is the smaller independent websites or individuals like Paranjoy who actually find the time and the money to go after these facts and unearth them. So I've long believed that the agenda for news is more often set by the smaller news entities than by the mainstream media, because they're the ones who actually go after what really is worth finding out. And then it's the mainstream media, when it becomes a big enough issue, the mainstream media picks it up and then it becomes a much bigger issue. So, I mean, even in Watergate for a long time, nobody was picking up what Washington Post was saying. No other media in the US was picking it up. It was just Washington Post running alone with these series of disclosures, until finally it just became too big for others to ignore, and then everybody piled onto it. It does, the smaller entities do show greater commitment to the purpose of journalism than many mainstream companies. That's a fact. And that's why I think it's certainly the foundation which I happen to be involved with has funded small independent websites because we believe that they are the ones who make the difference.
There's a question here.
Yes,
Yeah,
that's
sure,
right.
Paranjoy. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to respond to that question.
Which is that why the focus on
I don't know
corporate
who it is.
media.
Yes, please go on.
No, I mean, the question simply, why the focus on corporate-owned media when, in fact, media has always been owned by large business houses? So I guess, I mean, the underlying context here is that what has shifted or has enough shifted, and in which direction, and what are we sort of looking? Yeah.
And there are three names also given over there: Kota, Birla, Tatas. I'll just draw your attention
to which we can add Ambani and Adani now, of course.
No, that's the point. That's precisely the point. Way back in the early 50s, around the time I was born, there was a particular person, he was a professor, he wrote a book on the Birlas. He wrote a book on the Birlas, which was based essentially from leaked information provided by one of the tax officials. And this person was, he brought out a book, The Mystery of the Birla House, which is also published in Bangla, called Birla Bari Rahasyo. And the story is that the books were bought up and then eventually the printing press was bought up. But yes, it came up in the assembly. I, with some difficulty, managed to get a copy of the book in the rare books section of Amazon, and I had to pay quite a lot of money to get it. But there are records in the assembly. So that it is from there. But to add to that point that you made, Anant, is that some of the richest men in India are also the biggest owners of the media, and notably the Reliance Industries Group, headed by Mr. Mukesh Ambani, and of course, with the acquisition of NDTV, formerly New Delhi Television, by the Adanis, what we are seeing is that I would say that the challenges and the constraints on reporting freely have become constrained. I mean, I think that obviously, you can't write any article, even if it's true, against Mr. Mukesh Ambani in his media organization, the Network 18. Nor can you expect to write something about the Adani Group in NDTV. But once upon a time, the owners were themselves less thin-skinned. And once information is in the public domain, there was a fair amount of give and take, and there was discussion. I see this is true for Indian society as a whole. We have become more intolerant, and those who are in positions of power and authority, they've always been intolerant, but of late they've become extremely vengeful, which is why I go back to all the income tax, ED, surveys, raids on several media organizations.
Mr. Nanan, any closing thought? We are already at the end of the session, but something to close the session with.
My take on this, Anant, is that media that are owned by families that do not have other larger business interests tend to be more independent and more journalism oriented than the ones that are owned by people who have much larger businesses at stake, because for them the stakes are much higher elsewhere, and so they're willing to sacrifice journalism in order to protect their other interests. So you tend to see this across the certainly the major Indian language, English language newspapers, and you look at the families that own some of them, and they have no other business interests, and they tend to be more journalism oriented than others. So big media, big business and media ownership doesn't actually go very well together.
He couldn't have said it better. I completely agree with what Mr. Ninan has said. I mean, look at the New York Times, the Washington Post until recently, but even then you can still say the Washington Post. A lot depends on the culture of the owners and the way they look at journalism, the way they look at freedom of expression. So
There's also this increasing trend where the websites are charging for access. Earlier, they were all free, and increasingly, so in fact, what I begin to see is this, there was a phase for about 3 or 4 decades when the bulk of the revenue, up to 90% of revenue for a media entity came from advertising. That is clearly changing.
and that's very good, very good.
And the pendulum is certainly swinging back towards the reader paying much more. And that will help actually greater independence in journalism, more reader orientation.
In fact,
Okay, I think Paranjoy, we are on at the end of time.
Fine. I mean,
the
you
next
can
panel
look
is
at some
waiting.
of these companies that are today getting the bulk or more than half of their total revenue from subscribers. Business Standard was one of the first newspapers to put several of its articles behind a paywall. We are seeing these models picking up. I would say it's still some time before they. I mean, large numbers of people are not willing to pay. Unfortunately.
The process is not complete. I just said the pendulum has started swinging back.
So we'll end at a positive note that maybe there is some light at the end of the tunnel, or maybe there's some silver lining where the focus is shifting back toward the reader, hopefully, and that pace will pick up in the years to come. Thank you, Mr. Ninan. Thank you, Paranjoy, Teresa. I'll hand the stage to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, TN Ninan, Paranjoy Guha Thakurta, and Anant Nath for a session that unveiled many facets of business journalism, the market, the economy, the corporates, and the challenges journalists have to rise to.